Paul, should we just publish everybody's salary like they do in Sweden and just be done with this?
I'm not sure that's necessary, and I'm not sure I would support it. And I guess as a trade unionist, I should be shouting about the gender pay gap from the roofs. But I have to say, I think it's largely meaningless because I don't think it really tells us what it is that we're looking for. What it tells us is the difference in average earnings across the country between men and women. But it doesn't tell us, it doesn't factor in the reasons why there is that distinction. You know, the fact that women are doing certain jobs, why are they doing particular jobs? Why are they sometimes doing particular jobs that are less in terms of salary than the jobs that men do? Is there an issue there about more women working part-time? Is it a work-life balance thing? Where they can only work part-time.
Well, some of them were compared like for like, so some of them, and even then there was a gap.
But, I mean, I think there are so many variables that unless you really get into the nitty-gritty of it, I don't think it can really tell you what it is that you need to know. I mean...
But if you publish them, right, OK, so that's fair enough, but if you publish them, I would know if I'm doing the exact same job as somebody else. I could look at some bloke who's doing the exact same job as me, I could see how much he's being paid, and I could work out whether or not he's being paid more, and if he was, I'd start to question that.
I think that's unlikely, Nana. Your seven-figure salary, there's no way a man's going to be keeping up with you, trust me.
I'll tell you that. That's why I never married anybody and not having half of my stuff. What about you, Charlotte?
I mean, I agree with Paul that the problem with this sort of analysis is that it is totally meaningless. So you're taking the average pay for men and the average pay for women. You're not comparing like for like. And actually, if you do compare like for like, you don't get much of a pay gap. But also, it distracts from the real issues we should be talking about. So whilst there may not really be much of a pay gap, there is certainly an earnings gap. And by that, I mean the points that Paul has made. So actually, we all know there are far more men in senior leadership and management roles than women. So that skews the numbers. And there are lots of reasons we should be looking at as to why that's the case. So why should it be that if a woman has had to take time out or has chosen to take time out to have a child, that then their earnings are impacted then for the rest of their career?
Okay, so yeah, there are variables, and that is true, and this study may not take into consideration some of those variables. But there will also be many instances where men and women are doing exactly the same thing and the man's getting paid more, which is one of the things that this did point out. Would you be happy if perhaps everybody had their salary so that you could find out what anyone was earning?
No,
that's what happens.
I think that would also be meaningless.
Why?
So let's say Paul and I are doing exactly the same job, right?
Paul gets paid more than you.
And Paul is better at the job than I am. That's a reasonable judgment,
but what
right?
if he is...
I believe in performance-based pay. I don't believe that just because we do the same thing, we should be paid the same.
But actually, what this is saying, potentially, and I think it can be skewed on many issues, and I agree with that. But what it is actually saying is, but if Paul was doing the exact same thing as you, and what if you're better than Paul? Paul's being paid more than you.
Yeah, I mean...
And you could actually check the salary of Paul. You could phone up the tax office and say, all right, I want to check out Paul Embry, how much is he getting? And in Sweden, if the pay gap is too big, the companies can be fined. If that were here, that would close the gap.
I mean, I'm certainly a supporter of equal pay legislation, and I think if you...
Which we have.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's be clear, it's illegal to do the things.
And that wonderful film...
If you don't know, then you can't tell.
That wonderful film made in Dagenham of the women machinists at the Ford motor plant in Dagenham back in the 60s who campaigned brilliantly. I grew up in the shadow of that Ford motor plant, by the way. They campaigned brilliantly in order to secure that equal pay legislation. And right and proper that if you are doing the same job and doing it as well as somebody else, and there's no element of performance-related pay, and you are paid less simply because of your biological sex, that's indefensible, and I think the law needs to intervene in situations like that.
And the thing is, many contracts you sign, you're not allowed to really tell people your salary, you're not supposed to tell people, but if it was a thing that you could actually find it out, don't you think that gap would close pretty super fast, especially if the companies would also be fined? If the gap was...
There's a confidentiality element there as well.
Well, they're not worried about that. You can call it, you can find out the person's, I think it's the income something.
I mean, I'm not sure I would support that. I mean, instinctively, I think if you are signing an employment contract with a particular salary, then unless there's good reason, for example, you're working in the public sector, you're a senior public leader or something, or a charity boss, where it's important to disclose that. I wouldn't necessarily say in all circumstances, every time, it would be necessary to disclose that. I think as long as you have robust equal pay legislation, you have proper enforcement rules around it.
We have all that, and it's...
And can, Nana, and you have stronger trade unions because you know the best.
Do you know
what? The best institutions in this country historically for driving up people's wages and bringing about fair pay is not employment organisations, it's not governments, it's trade unions.
That's what
that's the case for trade unions in a nutshell. You two would be earning fortunes more if you joined a trade union.
Trade unions have paralysed pretty much the economy and forced the government's hand. And actually, in this case, with all the strikes, they're actually trying to get rid of the government, which is what they said very clearly. No, they did very, very clearly. Mark Sawaska said that from the PCS union. He said specifically that was his goal, and the strikes would bring down the
strikes that are taking place at the moment involving hundreds of thousands, millions of trade union activists. They haven't woken up and voted for strike action because they want to get rid of the Tories, regardless of what their union leaders might think. They've done it because they think the economy is fundamentally unfair and they're being dealt a rough deal.
I don't think people would agree when they see a 65 grand salary from a railway driver. I don't think so. But let's see what you guys are saying with regard to this. Gender pay gap. Simon says, we all know the gender pay gap is a lie. It's illegal to pay a man more than a woman for the same jobs with the same hours, terms and conditions, and has been since the 70s. Well, that's not... Well, they're saying that there is a gender pay gap. That's what they've said with their research. Peter says, you never talk about the vast number of jobs where women get paid more than men. In the media's eyes, they do not exist. Well, that's the point. With my idea, or with Sweden idea, you could see how much people...
What are these jobs that women get paid vastly more than men? I mean, please, write in and tell me. I'm not aware of those.
I would query that. I mean, there might be the odd case where it happens, but to say that happens across the board, I mean, it's clearly...
Well, they didn't say it across the board, but in some jobs that is the case. But this would actually, if you could see someone's salary, that could potentially stop that from happening.